I am stepping in today for Jaana Kettunen, who was on the program, but was unfortunately up in the air on a flight at this particular time. So she asked me to step in, which I gladly did, because this is a cooperative work we did in a project we call the Nordic Career Ed Group. That has been a project going on for about 1.5 years now. It's about collaborating between the Nordic countries and independent areas that focusing on work experience in lower secondary education, or focusing on lower secondary career education in lower secondary education. But in this particular presentation, we'll be looking into work placement experience. And in the work that I'll be presenting for you today is made by the group here on the screen, Per Roswell and Marta Beini from Sweden, Jaana Kettunen from Finland, Arneidur Einarsdottir from Iceland, Randi Skovits from Denmark, and myself from Norway. And I work at the Norwegian University of Southeast Norway with these kind of subjects, and particularly career education. So I'm looking forward to sharing a bit of our Nordic collaboration with you today. And I'll be happy to answer on some of your questions you might have afterwards, and looking forward to the other presentations as well. So this is a empirical data that we used for this project comes from the Nordic Career Ed Countries papers, as we call them. In those papers, we gathered policy documents, curriculum, and research from the countries and self-governing areas as Denmark, Greenland, Finland, Iceland, Norway, and Sweden. And that was the start of our project to gathering these documents and looking into career education in the compulsory educations of our countries and areas. And the purpose was for our particular group, and this particular presentation was to describe and analyze the current state of art on workplace experience in lower secondary education in the Nordic countries. And we had to find this definition of work experience placements, which was quite a bit of work, because how do you define these activities that happen between school and areas of work? And we found this one to work for us. So we have a particular focus on what we call WEP, work experience placement. And showing our understanding of work experience placement, we highlight the students' movement from school context to work context, where activities are organized at the work site. So this doesn't happen at school, it happens at the work site. But there were different forms. It could be, we could talk about work experience for a day or several days or a week or even more. And we agreed to define work experience placement as a career learning activity for students in lower secondary school at the work site without the direct supervision of a teacher. So that was how we defined it and narrowed it down. So then we found that in the recent years, there's been renewed international interest on how schools assist students to learn and better prepare for work and working life. And one of the ways in which lower secondary education in the Nordic countries provides for students to learn about work is through work experience placement. And work experience placement offers one important means by which young people can formulate and test ideas about their future, learn about different roles and how organizations function, whilst developing work-relevant skills and habits. But within the Nordic countries, there's a strong tradition of career guidance with increasing focus on what citizens learn from taking part in career guidance and career education. So we can see that across our countries and areas. And previous analysis of career development items in PISA indicates that Nordic countries are forerunners in developing career education activities and that are valued by young citizens, but there are major differences in how such activities are implemented and practiced in the countries, which I, of course, will elaborate on. So how did we go about this? We limited ourselves to work experience placement in career education as formalized in policy documents. That's what we looked at. Our analysis highlights similarities and differences, into which degree and in which documents across the Nordic countries work experience placements is formalized. And we applied methods that are based on our previous experience of text analysis, and we found some similarities to the process of contents analysis and collective policy ethnography. That means that we used a preparation phase where we define and conceptualize work experience placements. We selected units of analysis, That is national policy documents, curriculum, and research concerning work experience placement. And then we had these national teams where we gathered data for each country respectively and translated it and summarized the data. Then as researchers, we read these summaries and we made sense of the data in order to straighten out unclarities. And then we started organizing the data and discussed the relation to relevant codes and categories that were tested in text as well as in tables. So these texts and tables that were tested towards the relevance of concepts and comparable units containing cross-national patterns and differences. So this was a highly collaborative process. And while we did this organizing phase of different theoretical concepts were tested in order to discuss the data, and we landed on the concepts of classification and framing of Bernstein. And we found it useful to discuss work experience placements since the concepts concern content and organization. So what do we mean here? Classification refers to insularity of content or knowledge. So A can only be A if it effectively can insulate itself from B. And in addition, Bernstein uses strong and weak classification. For an example, if A can be strongly or weakly classified in relation to B, transferred to the context of work experience placement, we understand classification as useful to discuss how work experience placements is strongly or weakly insulated from other school activities, with or without its own goals and descriptions. So they gave us a clear focus for analysis. And framing, on the other hand, refers to sequencing and pacing and control. And in the context of work experience placement, we have translated framing to duration, introduction, evaluation of work experience placement, and who is responsible or controls to find a work experience placement. So we have some findings I'd like to share with you before some discussions. Our comparative analysis of these policy documents, curriculum, and research concerning work experience with a particular focus on these experience in lower secondary education in Nordic countries, educational policy documents, they indicate that similarities as well as differences prevail. So we give descriptive accounts of these different countries from two perspectives, both from the career education in lower secondary school and from work experience placement in lower secondary school. But we also looked into the comparison of the key characteristics relating to work experience placement. So we looked into how is career guidance forwarded in these policy documents and organized, career education, work experience placement, and work experience placement and curriculum, the purpose of it, the duration of it, and the assessment of it. And we looked into the responsibility for finding work experience placement and what is the role of employers. And all these categories were forwarded through the analysis, what we moved through text and tables in collaboration. So a third finding is of similarity and differences. So there are similarities as well as differences between the Nordic educational policy documents regarding career education and career guidance and work experience placement in compulsory education. But except for Greenland, young people have the right to career guidance in all countries. In all countries and the self-governing area but Iceland, career education is compulsory, with the difference of it being integrated into all subjects in Denmark and Sweden. In Greenland, it's integrated in a subject called personal development, while in Finland and Norway, it's a timetable subject of its own. So here we find differences in where the subject of career education, how it is integrated in schools. And all countries and self-governing areas also have some kind of work experience programs for students in compulsory education, ranging from optional, which is Denmark, Iceland, Norway, and Greenland, to mandatory, which is Finland and Sweden. So Finland is the only Nordic country in which work experience placement is described in more detail in the curriculum. Well, it's vaguely mentioned in the curriculum of career education in Sweden and Norway and Denmark. So here are quite some differences. And while work experience placement in Sweden and Finland has a clear connection to career choice, in Norway, it serves a much broader purpose of giving the pupils knowledge of the dynamics affecting the labor market. And Denmark, Iceland, and Greenland have no formulated purpose of work experience placement. So this was really interesting to look into in detail. But there's another findings here about similarities and differences. and they are about the organization. In Denmark, Finland, and Sweden, the duration of work experience placement is described, with Finland having 13 days in total from grade 7 to 9, Sweden 10 days in total, grade 8, 9, and Denmark 15 optional days in grade 8, 10. So in Denmark, you have to advocate for yourself that you want to go on a work experience placement, but then there are 15 optional days to do so. In Norway, Iceland, and Greenland, the duration is not stated in the curriculum. So even though work experience placement is mandatory in Sweden, it's not evaluated or graded. And in Finland, it is assessed by the workplace and self-assessed by the students. But in all the other countries and the self-governing area, there's no description of assessment. So there are also differences in who is responsible for securing the placements. In Denmark, as mentioned, it's the responsibility of the students and the parents. You have to bring it up yourself as a student. While in Sweden, it's the school or the municipality that bears the responsibility. In Greenland, Norway, and Iceland, there's no description of who's responsible here. And finally, only Finland has a description of the role of the employer that's seen as a partner, but none of the other countries have such a description as Finland has on their part. So we have a few discussion points here as a result from this work. At the European level, including the Nordic countries, there are several arguments to strengthen workplace learning for adolescents and young adults. For example, it's argued that young people's time in education is getting longer and longer, and thus they're introduced to working life later, and work experience is seen as a possibility to enhance experience of working life. But working life is argued to be more turbulent, and work experience placement is seen as a possibility to learn about new workplace conditions. And thirdly, work experience placement is seen as a complement to school-based learning, since the latter does not facilitate the various informal forms of workplace learning. And when we then, in our analysis, looked at Bernstein's framing and classification, we found variations. So we'd like to discuss that all the included Nordic countries emphasize work experience related activities. However, those activities can refer to different degrees of strong or weak framing. For example, the duration of work experience placement is regulated or recommended in some countries, and thus mandatory in some countries, while optional in others. And in addition, school support in Denmark, Iceland, and Norway for these activities is locally decided and or depends on students' request to get work experience placement. And this might be a reflection of historical traditions or of national steering through policy. Finland seems to have the least deregulated education policy here. Okay, and there are variations in classification we found as well. In example, how work experience placement is described and what it is described to achieve as in form of goals. A description is lacking for Denmark, Iceland, and Greenland, and it's quite vaguely described in the overall curriculum for education and career in Norway and Sweden, while Finland has a more detailed description. So since described goals and description more or less are lacking for most compared countries, it makes it difficult to do national evaluations of if goals with work experience placement are achieved, and not the least cross-national comparisons between the Nordic countries. It's hard to do. So moving forward, we think that our analysis reflects difficulties when it comes to go further in research and compare how work experience placement in the Nordic countries is carried out. And our analysis makes an important stamp in time from where it becomes easier to detect and discuss trends in policy related to work experience placement in the Nordic countries in the future. But in addition, we thought about this. It would be intriguing to, for example, empirically investigate commonalities and differences in how work experience placement is understood by the students, despite differences in framing and classification of the activities. Still, since we detected that work experience placement in most countries were weakly framed and classified, we need to have in mind that such a comparison of the students' responses might rather be a comparison reflecting local governance and national differences, especially since research shows that, among other things, for example, career guidance activities differ locally. Nevertheless, since supporting young people not only to adapt to how things are, but also supporting emancipatory processes, to investigate those questions further seems to be an important task in a working life that is commonly described as constantly changing. I hope, of course, that these perspectives from these Nordic collaboration are of interest to you, that they shine some light on where you are in the world and the practices and the policies that you relate to. And if you want to look more into what we do in the Nordic Career Ed project, here's the link to the site, and you can just Google Nordic Career Ed and it comes up. And of course, you can contact me or Jaana if you would like to know more about this.